Mama says we're born up here and we'll die up here.
Have you ever wondered what happens when religious devotion twists into something far more sinister? Deep in the mist-covered hollers of Appalachia, where federal law was more of a suggestion than a mandate, certain groups found the perfect isolation to practice beliefs that would make your blood run cold. These weren't your typical Sunday morning congregations. These were cults that used scripture to justify murder, manipulation, and acts so disturbing that even hardened law enforcement officers refused to discuss the details publicly. Today, we're venturing into the darkest corners of American religious history, exploring 7 deadly cults that flourished in the remote mountains where screams echoed through valleys and nobody came to investigate. Hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about religious freedom in America. These stories were deliberately buried by authorities who believed some truths were too dangerous for the public to know. So before you take comfortable, take a minute to like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you tuning in from and what time it is for you. 1. The Serpent's Covenant of Harlan County. In 1963, a charismatic preacher named Jeremiah Kane arrived in the coal mining town of Everts, Kentucky, carrying nothing but a worn Bible and a wooden crate that seemed to move on its own. The locals, struggling with mine closures and widespread unemployment, were drawn to his passionate sermons about divine protection and the power of faith to overcome any earthly trial. Within months, Kane had established what he called the Serpent's Covenant, a religious movement that took biblical snake handling to terrifying extremes. What started as traditional Appalachian serpent handling quickly evolved into something far more sinister. Kane preached that true believers could survive any test of faith, including drinking poison, handling fire, and most disturbing of all, allowing venomous snakes to bite them repeatedly as proof of divine favor. Members who showed fear or hesitation were publicly shamed and subjected to what Kane called purification rituals that involved prolonged exposure to multiple snake bites until they either proved their faith or died trying. The cult operated from a converted mining facility deep in the mountains, where Kane maintained dozens of venomous serpents in makeshift wooden boxes. Former members who later spoke to authorities described nightly ceremonies where participants would dance with rattlesnakes, copperheads, and timber rattlers while Kane shouted about the approaching end times. Those who survived multiple bites developed a strange immunity, but many others weren't so fortunate. Local hospital records show an unusual spike in snakebite fatalities between 1963 and 1967, though families often refused to report deaths, believing their loved ones had achieved martyrdom. The most chilling aspect of the Serpent's Covenant wasn't the snake handling itself, but how Kane used it to maintain absolute control over his followers. Children as young as 8 were required to participate in handling sessions, with parents forced to watch as their sons and daughters risked death to prove their devotion. Those who refused were cast out of the community, losing their homes, jobs, and families in the process. Kane claimed he received direct visions from God about which members needed to undergo trials, and these visions conveniently targeted anyone who questioned his authority. The cult's reign of terror ended abruptly in 1967 when a 13-year-old girl named Sarah Mackenzie died during a particularly brutal purification ceremony. Her father, a former coal miner named Thomas Mackenzie, had grown increasingly disturbed by Cain's methods, but felt trapped by the community's pressure to conform. When Sarah collapsed after being bitten by a timber rattler, Cain forbade anyone from seeking medical help, claiming that divine intervention would save her if she truly believed. She died in agony over the course of 6 hours, while her parents were forced to watch and pray. Thomas Mackenzie's grief transformed into rage, and he contacted federal authorities who had been quietly investigating reports of unusual deaths in the region. The subsequent raid revealed a compound where dozens of people lived in squalid conditions, surrounded by venomous snakes and stockpiles of homemade poison. Most disturbing were the detailed journals Cain kept, documenting each death as a spiritual victory and planning increasingly dangerous trials for his followers. The journals revealed that at least 43 people had died during purification ceremonies, including 17 children under the age of 16. Cain was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and child endangerment, but he died in custody before trial under mysterious circumstances. Officials claimed he suffered a heart attack, though fellow inmates reported that he had been found with mysterious puncture wounds on his arms and neck. The surviving cult members scattered throughout the region, with many requiring years of psychological treatment to recover from their experiences. Local authorities quietly demolished the compound, but hikers in the area still report finding abandoned snake boxes and hearing strange singing echoing through the valleys on moonless nights. 2. The Divine Harvest Brotherhood of Breathitt County. In the summer of 1971, a former seminary student named Marcus Whitfield established what he called the Divine Harvest Brotherhood in a remote valley of Breathitt County, Kentucky. Whitfield, who had been expelled from theological school for his radical interpretations of Scripture, attracted followers with his magnetic personality and promises of creating a perfect Christian community away from the corruption of modern society. What began as an idealistic religious commune quickly devolved into a nightmare of psychological manipulation, ritual abuse, and mass murder. The Brotherhood initially appeared to be a legitimate religious community, complete with organic farming, communal living, and regular Bible study sessions. Whitfield preached about the importance of spiritual purity and the need to separate from the sinful outside world. Families sold their possessions and moved to the compound, believing they were joining a movement that would bring them closer to God. The early months seemed to validate their faith as the community thrived, producing abundant crops and maintaining peaceful relationships with neighboring towns. However, Whitfield's true nature began to emerge as his control over the group solidified. He claimed to receive direct revelations from God about the spiritual state of individual members, and these revelations invariably identified supposed sins that required punishment. The punishment started small, public confessions, fasting, and isolation, but gradually escalated to physical beatings, sexual abuse, and forced participation in bizarre rituals designed to break down individual will and create absolute dependence on Whitfield's leadership. The most disturbing aspect of the Divine Harvest Brotherhood was Whitfield's obsession with what he called spiritual harvesting. He taught that certain members of the community were chosen vessels whose deaths would purify the entire group and ensure their collective salvation. These chosen ones were identified through elaborate ceremonies involving prayer, fasting, and the consumption of various herbs and mushrooms that grew wild in the surrounding forests. Those selected for harvesting were treated as sacred beings for their final weeks, receiving special foods and privileges before their appointed time. The harvesting ceremonies took place during new moon periods in a specially constructed underground chamber beneath the main compound building. Former members who managed to escape described these rituals as nightmarish spectacles where the chosen victim would be slowly poisoned while the entire community sang hymns and praised God for accepting their sacrifice. Whitfield claimed that the spirits of the harvested members remained with the community, guiding their decisions and protecting them from outside interference. Local authorities received their first reports of suspicious activity in early 1974 when a woman named Janet Morrison managed to escape the compound with her 2 young children. Morrison, who had joined the group after her husband's death in a mining accident, told investigators about the harvesting rituals and provided detailed descriptions of the underground chamber where she had witnessed multiple murders. Her testimony was initially dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized woman, but persistent questioning revealed disturbing consistencies in her account. The investigation was complicated by the Brotherhood's careful isolation and the loyalty of its remaining members. Whitfield had systematically severed all connections between his followers and the outside world, convincing them that law enforcement officers were agents of Satan sent to test their faith. When investigators attempted to visit the compound, they were met by armed guards who claimed to be protecting the community from persecution. The standoff lasted for several weeks, with negotiations breaking down repeatedly as Whitfield demanded that authorities recognize his divine authority and leave his people alone. The situation reached a horrific climax in September 1974 when federal agents finally obtained warrants to search the compound. As law enforcement prepared to breach the perimeter, Whitfield announced that the time for the final harvest had arrived. In a twisted interpretation of biblical prophecy, he convinced his remaining followers that their collective death would trigger the second coming of Christ and ensure their immediate entry into heaven. The resulting mass suicide claimed 87 lives, including 23 children under the age of 12. Investigators who entered the compound discovered a scene of unimaginable horror. The main building had been converted into a makeshift morgue where bodies were arranged in elaborate patterns that Whitfield believed would facilitate their spiritual ascension. The underground chamber contained evidence of at least 30 previous murders, with human remains carefully preserved in glass containers and arranged around a crude altar. Most disturbing were the detailed records Whitfield kept, documenting each harvesting ceremony and his plans for the final mass suicide that would complete his divine mission. The few survivors who had been away from the compound during the final harvest required extensive psychological treatment to recover from their experiences. Many reported persistent nightmares and an inability to participate in any form of organized religion. Local authorities struggled to explain how such a large-scale operation could have continued for over 3 years without detection, leading to significant changes in how law enforcement monitored isolated religious communities. 3. the Mountain Tabernacle of Eternal Flame. High in the remote peaks of western North Carolina, a former mental patient named Solomon Griggs established the Mountain Tabernacle of Eternal Flame in 1969. Griggs, who had been released from a state psychiatric facility after claiming to have been cured through divine intervention, attracted followers with his passionate preaching about the purifying power of fire and the need to burn away sin through literal flame. The tabernacle operated for over a decade, during which time at least 60 people died in what Griggs called purification ceremonies. The cult's central doctrine revolved around Griggs's interpretation of biblical passages about refining fire and spiritual purification. He taught that human flesh was inherently corrupt and that true believers could achieve spiritual perfection only by subjecting themselves to increasingly severe burning rituals. These ceremonies began with brief exposure to candle flames and gradually escalated to members walking through bonfires, holding red-hot metal objects, and eventually allowing themselves to be partially burned alive as proof of their faith. Griggs maintained strict control over his followers through a combination of religious fervor and psychological manipulation. He claimed to possess the ability to see into people's souls and identify specific sins that required burning away. Those who questioned his methods were subjected to particularly severe purification rituals, often resulting in permanent disfigurement or death. The community lived in constant fear of being selected for the next ceremony, creating an atmosphere of terror that prevented anyone from challenging Griggs's authority. The tabernacle's compound was built around a central fire pit that burned continuously, fed by a combination of wood, coal, and various chemical substances that Griggs claimed enhanced the spiritual power of the flames. Members were required to maintain the fire at all times, with failure to keep it burning considered a grave sin punishable by immediate purification. The surrounding buildings were constructed entirely of stone and metal to prevent accidental fires, though investigators later discovered that many of the deaths were deliberately caused by Griggs when he felt that members were losing faith. The cult's activities might have continued indefinitely if not for a forest fire in 1979 that forced emergency responders into the previously isolated compound. Firefighters discovered dozens of severely burned bodies in various stages of decomposition, along with evidence of ongoing torture and abuse. The few surviving members were found in a state of complete psychological breakdown, unable to provide coherent accounts of their experiences. Griggs himself was found dead in the central fire pit, apparently having chosen to undergo his own final purification rather than face capture. The Mountain Tabernacle of Eternal Flame represents one of the most disturbing examples of how religious extremism can flourish in isolated communities where normal social controls break down. The cult's legacy continues to haunt the region, with local residents reporting strange lights and the smell of burning flesh emanating from the abandoned compound site. Park rangers have documented numerous incidents of hikers becoming disoriented near the former tabernacle location, with some requiring rescue after becoming lost in areas they had previously navigated without difficulty. These three cults represent just the beginning of our journey into the darkest corners of Appalachian religious extremism. Each group demonstrates how charismatic leaders can exploit the isolation and desperation of mountain communities to create their own twisted kingdoms of terror. The combination of religious fervor, geographic isolation, and economic desperation created perfect conditions for these predators to flourish, often for years or even decades before authorities could intervene. What makes these stories even more chilling is the pattern that emerges when you study them closely. Each cult followed a similar trajectory. Charismatic leader arrives in desperate community, offers hope and salvation, gradually increases control through fear and manipulation, then ultimately destroys everyone who trusted them. The isolation of these mountain communities created perfect hunting grounds for predators who understood that people pushed to their breaking point will accept almost any promise of relief from their suffering. 4. The Sacred Blood Covenant of Pike County. In 1978, a drifter named Abraham Thorne arrived in the economically devastated coal town of Pikeville, Kentucky, carrying a leather satchel filled with what he claimed were ancient religious texts. Thorne, who spoke with the educated vocabulary of someone who had clearly received formal theological training, quickly gained attention for his passionate sermons about the power of blood sacrifice to cleanse sin and ensure salvation. Within months, he had established the Sacred Blood Covenant, a religious movement that would terrorize the region for nearly 8 years. Thorne's initial teachings seemed to align with traditional Christian doctrine, focusing on the redemptive power of Christ's blood and the need for believers to make sacrifices for their faith. However, his interpretation of sacrifice quickly evolved beyond metaphorical meaning. He taught that animal blood was insufficient for true purification, and that human blood, freely given by devoted believers, possessed the power to wash away not just individual sins, but the collective guilt of entire communities. His followers, desperate for hope in a region where unemployment had reached devastating levels, embraced these teachings with frightening enthusiasm. The cult's compound was established in an abandoned mining facility, where Thorne constructed what he called the Altar of Eternal Cleansing. This elaborate stone structure, built by members using materials scavenged from defunct mining operations, featured channels carved into its surface that directed blood flow into collection vessels positioned around its base. Thorne claimed these vessels contained the accumulated spiritual power of everyone who had offered their blood in service to God, and he used this supposed power to perform what he called miraculous healings and prophecies. The blood collection rituals began with small cuts on members' hands and arms, but Thorne's demands quickly escalated as he claimed to receive visions requiring larger sacrifices. Members were required to donate increasing amounts of blood during weekly ceremonies, with those who showed reluctance subjected to public humiliation and accusations of insufficient faith. The weakest members, including elderly individuals and children, often collapsed during these sessions, but Thorne forbade medical intervention, claiming that divine healing would restore anyone with true belief. Thorne maintained detailed records of each member's blood donations, treating the information like a spiritual ledger that determined their standing within the community. Those who gave the most blood received special privileges and leadership positions, while those who gave less faced increasing pressure to prove their devotion through larger sacrifices. The system created a horrifying competition where members literally bled themselves to death, trying to earn Thorne's approval and secure their place in what he promised would be an eternal paradise. The cult's activities became increasingly bizarre as Thorne's psychological control deepened. He began claiming that certain members possessed blood with special spiritual properties that could heal others or provide protection against evil forces. These chosen individuals were subjected to regular blood harvesting sessions, where large quantities of their blood were collected and distributed to other members during communion ceremonies. The chosen ones were treated as living saints, but their elevated status came at the cost of severe anemia and eventual death from blood loss. Local authorities received their first reports of suspicious activity in 1982 when a nurse at the regional hospital noticed an unusual pattern of patients arriving with symptoms consistent with chronic blood loss. The victims, all of whom claimed to be members of a religious group, refused to provide details about their condition and discharged themselves against medical advice. Hospital staff became increasingly concerned when several patients returned multiple times with worsening symptoms, but their attempts to investigate were met with silence and threats from other cult members. The investigation was complicated by the cult's extensive network of informants within the local community. Thorne had strategically recruited members from various professions, including law enforcement, healthcare, and government offices, creating a web of loyalty that protected the group from outside scrutiny. These insider members provided advance warning of any official investigations while simultaneously gathering intelligence about potential threats to the cult's operations. The Sacred Blood Covenant's reign of terror reached its climax in 1985 when Thorne announced that God had revealed the need for a final, ultimate sacrifice that would purify the entire region and usher in a new age of spiritual enlightenment. This revelation came during a period when several members had begun questioning his increasingly extreme demands, and some had even attempted to leave the group. Thorne's response was to declare that these doubters were infected with spiritual corruption that threatened the salvation of all believers. The final ceremony took place during a 3-day period in March 1985, when Thorne convinced his remaining followers that their collective death would transform them into divine beings capable of cleansing the world of sin. Unlike other mass suicide cults, Thorne's followers died slowly over the course of several days as they were systematically drained of blood during extended ritual sessions. The process was designed to maximize suffering, which Thorne claimed would increase the spiritual power of their sacrifice. Federal agents who raided the compound discovered a scene that veteran investigators described as the most disturbing crime scene they had ever encountered. The altar area was saturated with blood, and the surrounding chambers contained dozens of bodies in various stages of decomposition. Most shocking were the detailed journals Thorne kept, documenting his psychological manipulation techniques and his plans for expanding the cult's influence throughout the region. The journals revealed that over 150 people had died during the cult's 8-year existence, with many deaths carefully staged to appear accidental or natural. 5. The Wilderness Shepherds of Wise County. In the remote mountains of Wise County, Virginia, a former prison chaplain named Ezekiel Marsh established the Wilderness Shepherds in 1974. Marsh, who had been dismissed from his chaplaincy position for inappropriate conduct with inmates, attracted followers with his powerful sermons about surviving the coming apocalypse and the need to prepare for a final battle between good and evil. The cult operated from a heavily fortified compound where members lived in military-style conditions while preparing for what Marsh called the Great Tribulation. The wilderness shepherds differed from other mountain cults in their emphasis on survival training and weapons stockpiling. Marsh taught that true believers needed to be prepared to defend themselves against government forces, foreign invaders, and demonic entities that would emerge during the end times. Members spent their days engaged in combat training, weapons maintenance, and the construction of elaborate defensive systems around their compound. The combination of religious fervor and military-style discipline created a uniquely dangerous environment where violence was not just accepted, but celebrated as a sacred duty. Marsh's control over his followers was absolute, enforced through a strict hierarchy that resembled a military command structure more than a traditional religious organization. Members were assigned ranks based on their perceived spiritual maturity and combat readiness, with promotions requiring increasingly dangerous tests of loyalty and faith. Those who failed these tests faced court-martial style proceedings that often resulted in severe punishment or expulsion from the group. The constant threat of discipline kept members in a state of perpetual anxiety, making them more susceptible to Marsh's psychological manipulation. The cult's compound was designed as a fortress with underground bunkers, concealed weapons caches, and elaborate early warning systems that could detect approaching vehicles from miles away. Members lived in Spartan conditions, with all resources dedicated to preparing for the anticipated final battle. Children were trained from an early age to handle weapons and participate in combat drills, with those who showed fear or reluctance subjected to intensive conditioning designed to eliminate their natural emotional responses. Marsh's paranoia about government infiltration led to increasingly violent screening procedures for new members and periodic purges of existing followers suspected of disloyalty. These purges often involved elaborate tests designed to identify potential spies or traitors, with failure resulting in immediate execution disguised as training accidents. The cult's isolation and military-style discipline made it nearly impossible for members to communicate with the outside world or seek help from authorities. The wilderness shepherds' activities attracted federal attention in 1981 when weapons dealers reported unusual purchases of military-grade equipment by individuals connected to the group. The subsequent investigation revealed that the cult had amassed an arsenal that included automatic weapons, explosives, and sophisticated communication equipment. Most disturbing was evidence that Marsh had been planning attacks on government facilities and civilian targets that he believed were controlled by satanic forces. The standoff that followed lasted for over 2 months, with federal agents surrounding the compound while attempting to negotiate a peaceful surrender. Marsh used the siege as proof that his prophecies about government persecution were coming true, further solidifying his control over his followers. The situation deteriorated rapidly when cult members began launching attacks on federal positions, resulting in casualties on both sides and increasing pressure for a decisive resolution. The final assault on the compound revealed the full extent of the cult's militarization and the psychological damage inflicted on its members. investigators found evidence of extensive weapons manufacturing, detailed plans for terrorist attacks, and training materials for chemical and biological warfare. Most disturbing were the children, many of whom had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they attacked rescue workers and had to be physically restrained to prevent them from harming themselves or others. The legacy of the wilderness shepherds continues to influence extremist movements throughout the region, with several smaller groups claiming to carry on Marsh's teachings about the need for armed resistance against government tyranny. Law enforcement agencies maintain active surveillance of these successor groups, recognizing that the combination of religious extremism and military training creates an ongoing threat to public safety. 6. The Eternal Vigil of Bell County. Perhaps the most psychologically disturbing of all Appalachian cults was the Eternal Vigil, established in 1976 by a former psychology professor named Dr. Margaret Sinclair in the isolated mountains of Bell County, Kentucky. Sinclair, who had lost her university position after conducting unauthorized experiments on students, used her knowledge of psychological manipulation to create a religious movement that systematically destroyed the minds of its followers while convincing them they were achieving spiritual enlightenment. The Eternal Vigil's central doctrine revolved around Sinclair's claim that sleep was a form of spiritual weakness that prevented believers from achieving true communion with God. She taught that by remaining constantly awake, followers could transcend their physical limitations and achieve a higher state of consciousness that would allow them to perceive divine truth directly. This teaching provided the foundation for a systematic program of sleep deprivation that left members in a state of perpetual exhaustion and psychological vulnerability. Sinclair's compound was designed to facilitate constant wakefulness, with bright lights maintained at all hours and a schedule of activities that prevented members from ever having extended periods of rest. Those who showed signs of fatigue were subjected to stimulant drugs that Sinclair claimed were blessed sacraments capable of enhancing spiritual perception. The combination of sleep deprivation, chemical stimulation, and constant psychological pressure created a state of altered consciousness that made members extremely susceptible to Sinclair's influence. The cult's recruitment process targeted individuals who were already experiencing psychological distress, including recent widows, unemployed minors, and people struggling with mental illness. Sinclair's background in psychology allowed her to identify and exploit specific vulnerabilities in potential converts, using sophisticated manipulation techniques to break down their resistance and create absolute dependence on her guidance. New members were gradually introduced to the sleep deprivation regimen, with the process carefully calibrated to maximize psychological impact while minimizing the risk of immediate physical collapse. The most disturbing aspect of the Eternal Vigil was Sinclair's use of what she called revelation therapy, where severely sleep-deprived members would experience hallucinations that she interpreted as divine visions. These hallucinations, which were actually symptoms of extreme exhaustion and chemical manipulation, were recorded in detailed journals that Sinclair used to maintain control over the group's beliefs and behaviors. Members who reported visions that contradicted Sinclair's teachings were subjected to additional deprivation until their hallucinations aligned with her desired narrative. The compound's daily routine was designed to prevent any opportunity for rest or independent thought. Members were required to participate in continuous prayer sessions, physical labor, and group confessions that lasted for days at a time. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were revived with stimulants and forced to continue participating, with failure to maintain wakefulness treated as a sign of spiritual corruption that required immediate correction through increased deprivation. Sinclair's psychological expertise made her particularly effective at identifying and neutralizing potential resistance within the group. She established a system of constant surveillance where members were required to report on each other's spiritual progress, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that prevented anyone from questioning her methods. Those who showed signs of doubt or rebellion were subjected to intensive reconditioning sessions that often resulted in complete psychological breakdown. The cult's isolation from the outside world was maintained through a combination of physical barriers and psychological conditioning. Members were taught that contact with outsiders would contaminate their spiritual purity and interfere with their ability to receive divine revelations. Families who attempted to visit or communicate with cult members were turned away by armed guards who claimed to be protecting the community from spiritual corruption. Local authorities received their first reports of suspicious activity in 1979 when a former member named David Holbrook managed to escape the compound after suffering a complete nervous breakdown. Holbrook, who had been a respected teacher before joining the cult, was found wandering along a mountain road in a state of severe psychological distress. His account of the Eternal Vigil's practices was initially dismissed as the ravings of a mentally ill person, but persistent investigation revealed disturbing consistencies in his testimony. The investigation was complicated by the cult's sophisticated understanding of legal loopholes and psychological manipulation. Sinclair had carefully structured the group's activities to avoid obvious criminal violations while maintaining absolute control over her followers. When investigators attempted to interview cult members, they encountered individuals who appeared to be functioning normally, but displayed signs of severe psychological conditioning that made them incapable of providing accurate information about their experiences. The situation reached a crisis point in 1982 when several members died from what appeared to be natural causes, but were later determined to be the result of prolonged sleep deprivation and chemical abuse. The deaths were carefully spaced over several months and occurred in ways that made them difficult to attribute to cult activities. However, medical examinations revealed patterns of organ failure and brain damage consistent with extreme sleep deprivation and stimulant abuse. The final confrontation with the Eternal Vigil occurred in 1983 when federal agents obtained warrants to search the compound based on evidence of drug trafficking and child endangerment. The raid revealed a facility that resembled a combination of laboratory and prison, with sophisticated equipment for monitoring members' vital signs and dispensing controlled substances. Most disturbing was the discovery of detailed research files documenting the psychological effects of sleep deprivation on different types of individuals. Sinclair was found dead in her private quarters, apparently having overdosed on the same stimulants she had been giving to her followers. The surviving cult members required extensive medical treatment and psychological rehabilitation, with many suffering permanent brain damage from prolonged sleep deprivation. Several members never fully recovered their ability to sleep normally, requiring ongoing medical intervention to manage the lasting effects of their experiences. The Eternal Vigil case led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies investigate religious groups suspected of psychological abuse. The sophisticated nature of Sinclair's manipulation techniques demonstrated the need for specialized training in recognizing and responding to psychological coercion. Mental health professionals who worked with the survivors developed new treatment protocols for victims of systematic psychological abuse. 7. The Final Judgment Congregation of McCreary County. The most recent and perhaps most terrifying of the Appalachian death cults was the Final Judgment Congregation, established in 1995 by a charismatic preacher named Reverend Isaiah Blackwood in the remote wilderness of McCreary County, Kentucky. Blackwood, who claimed to be a direct descendant of Old Testament prophets, attracted followers with his apocalyptic visions and promises that his congregation would be the only survivors of an imminent divine judgment that would destroy the rest of humanity. Unlike the earlier cults that focused on purification through suffering, the Final Judgment Congregation was built around the concept of earned salvation through the elimination of those deemed spiritually corrupt. Blackwood taught that God had chosen his followers to serve as instruments of divine justice, tasked with identifying and destroying sinners before the final judgment arrived. This doctrine provided religious justification for a systematic campaign of murder that targeted anyone who opposed the cult's activities or refused to accept Blackwood's authority. The congregation's compound was constructed as a self-sufficient community designed to survive the approaching apocalypse. Members lived in military-style barracks and followed a rigid schedule of training, indoctrination, and preparation for what Blackwood called the Great Cleansing. The compound included weapons manufacturing facilities, food storage areas, and communication equipment that allowed the cult to monitor law enforcement activities throughout the region. Blackwood's recruitment strategy focused on individuals who had been marginalized by mainstream society, including ex-convicts, drug addicts, and people struggling with mental illness. He offered these desperate individuals a sense of purpose and belonging while simultaneously exploiting their vulnerabilities to create absolute loyalty to his cause. New members underwent intensive indoctrination sessions that combined religious instruction with psychological conditioning designed to eliminate their capacity for independent moral judgment. The cult's doctrine of divine justice was implemented through what Blackwood called purification missions, where selected members would venture into surrounding communities to eliminate individuals who had been identified as obstacles to God's plan. These missions were planned with military precision, with detailed intelligence gathering and carefully coordinated attacks designed to minimize the risk of detection. The victims were chosen based on Blackwood's supposed revelations, though investigation later revealed that most targets had simply posed some threat to the cult's security or recruitment efforts. The Final Judgment Congregation's activities escalated dramatically in 1998, when Blackwood announced that the time for the Great Cleansing had arrived. This revelation coincided with increased law enforcement attention to the cult's activities and growing resistance from local communities who had become aware of the group's dangerous nature. Blackwood used this external pressure as evidence that his prophecies were being fulfilled, further radicalizing his followers and increasing their willingness to engage in violence. The cult's final campaign of terror lasted for nearly 6 months, during which time at least 37 people were murdered in attacks throughout eastern Kentucky and neighboring states. The victims included law enforcement officers, journalists, and civilians who had spoken out against the cult's activities. The systematic nature of the attacks created widespread panic throughout the region, with many communities requesting federal protection from what appeared to be a coordinated terrorist campaign. The investigation into the Final Judgment congregation required the coordination of multiple law enforcement agencies and the deployment of specialized tactical units trained in dealing with heavily armed religious extremists. The cult's sophisticated security measures and extensive weapons stockpile made direct confrontation extremely dangerous, requiring months of surveillance and intelligence gathering before authorities could safely approach the compound. The final siege of the compound lasted for 3 weeks, with federal agents attempting to negotiate a peaceful surrender while preparing for what appeared to be an inevitable, violent confrontation. Blackwood used the siege as proof that the final judgment was at hand, convincing his followers that their deaths would trigger the apocalyptic events that would destroy their enemies and establish God's kingdom on earth. So the compound's destruction came not through direct assault, but through a massive fire that consumed the entire facility along with most of its inhabitants. Investigators later determined that the fire had been deliberately set by cult members following Blackwood's final order to choose martyrdom over surrender. The blaze was so intense that it took days to cool sufficiently for recovery teams to enter, and the extreme heat had destroyed most evidence of the cult's activities. The few survivors who had been away from the compound during the final siege provided investigators with detailed accounts of the cult's inner workings and the psychological techniques used to maintain control over members. These testimonies revealed the sophisticated nature of Blackwood's manipulation methods and the extent to which he had succeeded in creating a completely isolated society where normal moral constraints had been systematically eliminated. The Final Judgment congregation case marked a turning point in how law enforcement agencies approach religious extremism, demonstrating the need for proactive intervention before such groups can fully establish themselves in isolated communities. The cult's ability to operate undetected for several years while planning and executing numerous murders highlighted significant gaps in intelligence sharing and coordination between different law enforcement agencies. These 7 deadly cults represented the darkest chapters in Appalachian religious history, demonstrating how the region's isolation and economic desperation created perfect conditions for charismatic predators to establish their own kingdoms of terror. Each group followed a similar pattern of recruitment, indoctrination, and escalating violence, yet each also developed unique methods of control that reflected their leaders' particular psychological profile and manipulative abilities. The legacy of these cults continues to influence the region today, with many communities remaining suspicious of outsiders claiming religious authority and law enforcement agencies maintaining heightened awareness of potential extremist activities. The stories serve as stark reminders of how quickly religious freedom can be perverted into religious tyranny when the right circumstances align with the wrong leadership. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is not just the scale of violence and abuse they encompassed, but the way they exploited fundamental human needs for belonging, purpose, and hope. The victims were not weak or gullible people, but individuals facing genuine hardships who were seeking answers to real problems. Their willingness to follow these charismatic leaders into darkness reflects the desperation that can drive people to accept almost any promise of salvation when their circumstances become unbearable. The most chilling aspect of studying these 7 deadly cults is recognizing the warning signs that appeared long before their final acts of violence. Each group began with seemingly legitimate religious activities, prayer meetings, community service, and promises of spiritual healing for wounded souls. But beneath these surface appearances, the same psychological mechanisms were at work: isolation from outside influences, gradual escalation of control, and the systematic replacement of individual conscience with absolute obedience to a charismatic leader. What's particularly disturbing is how these cults exploited the unique characteristics of Appalachian culture to achieve their goals. The region's history of self-reliance and suspicion of government authority made it easier for cult leaders to justify their separation from mainstream society. The economic desperation that plagued many mountain communities created vulnerable populations desperate for hope and meaning, and the geographic isolation provided perfect cover for activities that would have been quickly detected in more populated areas. The psychological techniques used by these cult leaders were remarkably sophisticated, often surpassing methods employed by trained interrogators and military psychological operations specialists. They understood that complete control required not just physical domination, but the systematic destruction of their followers' ability to think independently. Through sleep deprivation, malnutrition, constant surveillance, and the creation of artificial crises, they transformed ordinary people into willing participants in their own destruction. Perhaps most tragically, many of the victims could have been saved if intervention had occurred earlier in the process. The gradual nature of cult indoctrination means that there are often months or even years when outside intervention might have broken the cycle of abuse. But the isolation of these mountain communities meant that warning signs were often ignored or explained away until it was too late to prevent the inevitable tragedies. The law enforcement response to these cults revealed significant gaps in the system designed to protect vulnerable populations. Local police departments, often understaffed and lacking specialized training, were ill-equipped to recognize the signs of cult activity or respond effectively when reports of abuse emerged. Federal agencies had the resources but often lacked the local knowledge needed to understand the unique dynamics of Appalachian communities. These cases also highlight the complex relationship between religious freedom and public safety. The First Amendment's protection of religious expression created legal barriers that cult leaders exploited to shield their activities from scrutiny. Courts struggled to balance respect for religious autonomy with the need to protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation and abuse. The result was often a system that failed to act until after significant harm had already occurred. The survivors of these cults faced enormous challenges in rebuilding their lives after escaping or being rescued. Many suffered from severe psychological trauma that required years of specialized treatment. Others struggled with guilt and shame over their participation in cult activities, even when they had been victims of sophisticated manipulation. The stigma associated with cult involvement often made it difficult for survivors to reintegrate into their communities, creating ongoing isolation that sometimes lasted for decades. The children who grew up in these cults faced particularly severe challenges. Many had never attended regular schools, received proper medical care, or experienced normal social relationships. Their entire understanding of reality had been shaped by the cult's distorted worldview, making it extremely difficult for them to adapt to life outside the group. Some never fully recovered from their experiences, carrying the psychological scars into adulthood and sometimes passing them on to their own children. The impact of these cults extended far beyond their immediate victims to affect entire communities throughout the region. Families were torn apart when members joined these groups, creating lasting wounds that often never fully healed. Local businesses suffered when cult members withdrew from normal economic activities. Schools and healthcare systems struggled to provide services to cult children who had been deliberately isolated from these basic social institutions. The media coverage of these cults often sensationalized the most dramatic aspects of their activities while failing to explore the underlying social and economic conditions that made them possible. This superficial treatment contributed to stereotypes about Appalachian culture and religion while obscuring the real lessons that could be learned from these tragedies. The focus on bizarre rituals and charismatic leaders distracted from the systemic failures that allowed these groups to operate undetected for so long. Modern law enforcement agencies have learned important lessons from these historical cases, developing new protocols for identifying and responding to potentially dangerous religious groups. Specialized training programs now teach officers to recognize the warning signs of cult activity, while improved communication systems allow for better coordination between different agencies. Mental health professionals have also developed more effective treatment methods for cult survivors, drawing on decades of research into the psychological effects of systematic abuse. However, the conditions that allowed these cults to flourish have not entirely disappeared. Economic hardship, social isolation, and the search for meaning continue to create vulnerable populations throughout the region. New forms of extremism often spread through social media and online communities pose different but equally serious threats. The challenge for modern society is to remain vigilant against these dangers while preserving the religious freedom and cultural autonomy that define American democracy. The stories of these 7 deadly cults serve as a stark reminder that evil can flourish anywhere when good people fail to act. The victims were not statistics, but real individuals with names, families, and dreams that were destroyed by charismatic predators who exploited their deepest needs and fears. Their deaths were not inevitable, but resulted from a series of failures, personal, institutional, and societal, that allowed these tragedies to unfold. As we remember these victims and honor their memory, we must also commit to learning from their experiences. The warning signs are there for those willing to see them. The systems exist to protect vulnerable populations if we have the courage to use them. The choice between allowing such tragedies to repeat or taking action to prevent them lies with each of us. The mountains of Appalachia have witnessed both great beauty and terrible darkness throughout their long history. These 7 cults represent some of the darkest chapters in that story, but they need not define the region's future. By understanding what happened and why, we can work to ensure that such horrors never again find fertile ground in these ancient hills where so many people have sought refuge, hope, and a better life for themselves and their children. The echoes of these tragedies still resonate through the hollers and valleys where they occurred, serving as permanent reminders of the price of indifference and the cost of allowing evil to flourish unchecked. But they also stand as testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. The survivors who found the courage to rebuild their lives, the investigators who refused to give up seeking justice, and the communities that learned to heal from these wounds all demonstrate that even the most terrible darkness cannot extinguish the light of human compassion and determination. What story from today's exploration left you most disturbed? Have you heard whispers of other groups that might have operated in the shadows of these mountains? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to subscribe for more investigations into the hidden corners of American history. Our next journey will take us even deeper into the mysteries that lurk in places where civilization's light grows dim and ancient hungers still stir in the darkness.